We left off talking about the Hudson River School and the American Romantics. The American experience was something new and exciting in the Romantic movement. Now remember, the Romantics are all about individualism, the individual hero, the connection between man and nature is something to be held in awe and wondered at, and man being viewed as a part of that natural experience, and that sense of the fact that man cannot be put inside a logical box, that we are more than simply science and logic will allow. In America, Romanticism took a different path. Unlike its European counterparts, unlike British Romanticism, American Romanticism became what we call American Transcendentalism. American Transcendentalism basically was a different take on the Romantic ideals, a different understanding which was viewed as distinctly and uniquely American. Since America was a nation so completely founded on the ideals of individuality and individualism and the rights of the individual, Romanticism seemed to fit in perfectly with the American ideal. That idea of the individual going his own way, that idea that became the anti-hero in England, found new life. It found new life in America. Now, this new life basically took on Romanticism and transformed it into the ultimate individualism for people and a deep connection between the person and nature around them. The British Romantics tended to view nature as providing insight into the individual and the growth of the human being. The Americans tended to view nature and the individual as interconnected. The individual was a part of nature, shaping it, recreating it. The person had a certain degree of control and over nature, and nature had that control over the individual as well. Among these American Transcendentalists, one of the starters, the originators, was Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson begins viewing Romanticism in a different way. Instead of, as the British Romantics did, looking at nature and saying, this is how I connect to nature. This is what I have learned about nature, and this is what nature teaches me about myself. Emerson instead said, I am a transcriber of nature. My personhood is a part of nature, and nature is a part of my personhood. In the quote that's on your screen, Emerson says that he becomes a transparent eyeball. He is nothing and he sees all. That sounds really trippy, but what he's actually saying is that he is a transcriber. He sees the world around him and he recreates it on paper so that his viewer may see it afresh when they read his work. Basically, instead of saying, I'm going to tell you what nature means to me, he says, I am going to recreate my view of nature on the written page so that when you read what I have written, you will see nature the way I see it through my own eyes. That idea is expanded upon by Thoreau. Thoreau is the ultimate individualist. He sees man as being intrinsically a part of nature. He says that man should leave behind society to learn the truth of nature and to become one with nature. In fact, Thoreau actually does leave society. He spends several years living by a lake, simply trying to become part of nature, to understand nature, to become a part of and transcriber of nature and of the natural experience. Emerson and Thoreau, as Americans, believe in the ultimate individuality, and they both believe that there will be a single poet who will be able to recreate nature, who will be able to transcribe the wonder of the American experience and explain it in such a way that all the world will be able to participate in, understand, and become part of this experience of becoming one with nature and truly understanding individualism. The man who claims to be that poet, the great American poet, is actually another American writer from the American Transcendentalist movement. His name is Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman declares himself the great American poet. He declares that he is the one who transcribes the great experience of individuality. And his book, The Leaves of Grass, basically is Whitman writing about how he sees the world, how he is part of the world, and how the world is a part of him. Whitman strives to create this interactivity, this connection between himself and the world around him on a deeper level than any other writer or poet ever. Whitman tries to recreate freedom and individuality through his eyes for his readers. He believes that he is recreating the world so that other people can experience it anew through his point of view. Now, this idea that these writers, these American transcendentalists, actually recreate the world through their writing. When they write a description of the world, they are recreating the world. They are remaking it for other viewers. Gives rise to an idea, kind of written down, codified by a later critic. That idea comes down to us and is known to us as the idea of the American atom. That idea comes down to the fact that the Americans believe they are different than their European counterparts. They don't believe that they are limited. They are trapped by a past, by a heritage of hundreds of years of learning, of rule, of remembering how the Romans did things, of how the Greeks did things, of how the Middle Ages did things. The American experience is new because it starts fresh. We don't have that background. We don't have that baggage. And therefore, these American writers, these American poets believe that they can start anew. America will be the new Garden of Eden. We don't have to go back and look at how people in the past did things because we are starting afresh. We are recreating the world, remaking it from scratch, beginning all over again with a new idea, a new ideal, a new hope, a new dream. The idea of the American atom, recreating the world from scratch. Everything will be fresh. Everything will be new. We are not burdened with the sins of our fathers, is a very important forward step, all right? That step forward, that new beginning, is going to express a new attitude that's going to stick around for American artists and American writers all the way into the 1920s and 1930s. Now, America is recreating. America is beginning anew. America is starting from the Industrial Revolution. They are creating a new world of technology and wonder for the world around them. This new focus on technology is actually one of the greatest advantages and greatest downfalls of the new American nation. America has massive industrial complexes, massive factories, but most of them are actually located in the northeast of America. Much of the food for the American nation comes from the southeast and to a certain degree from the southwest. Now, that basic division between where technology and food production is located contributes to the great American Civil War of the late 1800s. Now, we teach our elementary school kids that the American Civil War was a moral fight over slavery. The Northerners wanted to abolish slavery. The Southerners clung to slavery. If there's any mention of economic factors, usually what's brought up is the fact that the Southerners were plantation owners, so they needed slaves. The Northerners weren't. They didn't need slaves, so the Southerners backed slavery and bad moral values, and the Northerners didn't back slavery and were good morality. It's not that simple, not by a long shot. The old factors that we talked about all the way back in the 1700s, that thing that we talked about when we talked about the American Revolution, the fact that the colonies really were not united. They had very different ways of doing things, different ways of looking at their world. There were Federalists who believed in a stronger centralized government, and there were Republicans who believed that every state should have their own way of doing things, their own monetary system, and so on and so forth. That didn't just like spontaneously disappear, okay? That's still around. There is still a fight going on over how strong the government, the federal government, should be. People who want a strong central government are called Federalists. Those people are predominantly centered in the Northeast countries. simply because the northeastern states are very close together. I mean, if you've been to New England, if you're from New England, you know it doesn't take a long time to drive from one state to another in New England. They're very close together, and therefore they share a common culture, a common way of doing things. It's easy to travel from one state to another, even in a time period where you have predominantly horses. There's still a strong shared common culture. They don't mind the idea of having a central government because they feel a central government could apply well to all of the different states. They pretty much do things the same way. Sure, we can share a government. The southern states, though, don't work that way. The southern states are predominantly farming states, although there are a lot of factories down there too. But whether it's farming or factory, those states are big land areas, and they do things differently. The Carolinas have a different way of doing things and a different culture than Georgia does. Excuse me. The idea of all of those states being run by a single government that treats them all the same is really objectionable because, darn it, the people who live there say, our states aren't the same. What do you mean you're going to treat us the same? No. We're not okay with that. The southern states are much more republicanist, much more favoring individual governments, with the federal government only handling military and infrastructure, roads, etc. The northern states tend to be much more federalist. They want a unified system of government. Add to that a history of different morality and different ways of looking at things. Northern states had never had slaves. Most of the northerners were Puritans or Quakers, religious systems that have always frowned on slavery and emphasized the idea that God helps those who help themselves. They always believed in working and finding your own way. If you don't find your own way, God will not bless you. The southern states always were basically run by wealthy nobility who had been given land in the New World. Those southern states always relied on slaves for a certain quality of life and for running farms. They had been doing this for hundreds of years, long before the founding of America. It's a different culture. The Northerners had never had slaves. Southerners had always had slaves. One believed in a strong centralized government, one liked states' rights. Add to that economic questions of factories, economic questions of farming, and you have a basic separation and divide. The Civil War is not just about slavery and non-slavery. The Civil War is about central government. The Civil War is about the morality of slavery, and the Civil War is about economic questions. The Civil War is an ugly, brutal, and horrible part of American history, but we're really not going to be looking at it in detail because we're not a history class. We're a class about how history and art go together. There is one oddly artistic thing, though, that we do have to mention in the Civil War, and it has to do with technology. The military technology of the Civil War creates some amazing innovations, which can be viewed, oddly enough, as works of art. The Civil War is a horrible, ugly war. It is violent. It is brutal. We do end up with some of the first professional photographs. Photography is really becoming feasible for the first time in history in the mid-1860s. And the advent of photography in the 1860s gives, for the first time, a visual record of the brutality of war. The Civil War fascinates us, the Civil War upsets us, the Civil War disturbs us on a level that many earlier wars don't, simply because we can look at pictures of the Civil War. We see the brutality of warfare. We get a glimpse of how horrible conditions were on the battlefield, thanks to photography. Now, the Civil War is also a perfect opportunity for photography, horrible as it is, simply because photography in the 1860s is not like photography now. Today we talk about photographs in terms of hundredths of a second in exposure. In the 1860s, most cameras' shutter speeds were between 2 and 15 seconds. That means if anything moves in the 2 to 15 seconds, your image does not turn out well. One of the best things to take pictures of in that context are dead people, because you know what? They don't move! Imagine that. So we do get images of the dead, images of the battlefield that shock us even today. That advent of photography is also going to change the artistic world. It's going to challenge why people draw pictures, why people paint pictures. Why do we bother with that when you can just take a photograph? So that's going to figure in. Keep that in mind. The other thing that changes here is how the war is fought. This is America, the New Eden. The idea is that America is going to do different things differently than anyone else ever has because America is a new and unique country. In that context, America goes further, pushes harder, and comes up with more technological innovations in warfare as well as everywhere else. We end up with things like this, recorded again by a camera, photography. This is the battle between the Merrimack and the Monitor, two ironclads. For the first time, America is abandoning the classic ideal of a wooden sailing ship and beginning to introduce much more quote-unquote modern styles of sailing ships. Iron ships that become the great-great-grandfathers of our modern military fleet and aircraft carriers. Now, this technological innovation is something at which America prides itself. America in the 1800s bills itself, considers itself, promotes itself as the center of technological innovation in the entire world. We are the inventors. We are the advancement. We are the innovators. Perhaps the greatest known of those innovators is a gentleman by the name of Thomas Edison. Edison is a brilliant innovator and inventor. Edison is also a brilliant self-promoter. Edison does invent a mind-boggling array of devices, but beyond that, Edison also claims to invent all sorts of things Edison doesn't necessarily invent. Edison comes up with ideas and then talks other people into selling him the patents for those ideas. Edison is an American ideal, an American atom, reinventing the world in his eyes, in his point of view, and selling himself as the greatest inventor that ever lived. Now, as the Americans are focusing on technology innovation, they are matched in England, perhaps not by technology, but by expansion and by heritage. England at this time in history is ruled by Queen Victoria. This is the age of Victorian England, one of the two greatest queens of England in history. The first would be Elizabeth, by the way. Queen Victoria introduces a remarkable era of peace, expansion, luxury, and rule throughout the world. Victorian England sets a standard for us, and it is a time period that again fascinates us and produces a remarkable array of art. Again, please notice Queen Victoria does not have a painted portrait here. Queen Victoria actually has a photograph. Under the rule of Queen Victoria, it is said that the sun never sets on the British Empire. And if you look at this, you can see why. All of these areas have been touched by, dominated by, controlled by England at some point in their history. Throughout all of this area, you can see British influence holding an incredible amount of sway and importance. The sun never sets on the British Empire because the British Empire is invested, involved, a part of the heritage of all of these countries across the globe. The British Empire here is interesting because there's a deep conflict going on. Whereas the Americans are confident in their America as a new Eden and their technological innovations in pushing toward a better future, the British are conflicted because while they truly believe that they are bringing innovation, civilization, and progress to their world, they also have a great guilt and a lack of understanding of how to deal with indigenous peoples, people who live there. One of the best examples of that deep conflict is a writer by the name of Rudyard Kipling. Kipling writes a lot of things. Yeah, he writes the Jungle Book, but he writes a great deal more than the Jungle Book. Kipling's writings center on India. Kipling himself serves military service for the Great British Empire in the environs of India. And Kipling's works reveal a great ambivalency, a great conflict and hesitation in how he views Britain's involvement in India. In Kipling's works, Kipling emphasizes the great sense of civilization and advancement that England is bringing. England is dragging those backward Indians into the New World. But at the same time, often Kipling portrays people from India as being far more human, far more genuine, far more honorable than their British counterparts. It's an interesting conflict, an interesting balance, if you will, an interesting tension between two different views that is emblematic of the British Empire under Queen Victoria, an empire that was so confident of its ability to bring civilization and progress, and yet at the same time an empire that had deep hesitations about what it was doing and had a lack of understanding of how to deal with its people, its conquered people. This sense of hesitation about how people should be treated and how individual peoples actually influence the world comes bubbling up very strongly in the writings of a German man named Karl Marx. Now, Karl Marx works with another gentleman named Engels, and Marx and Engels pen a book called The Communist Manifesto that presents a very, very new and different take on how human beings should run their government. Marx and Engels look at how human civilization has been run, kings, dictators, republics, democracies, empires, and Marx and Engels propose that none of those ways of running a government is the right way. Marx and Engels look back through human history, and Marx and Engels say that all of human history is characterized by one basic question or dynamic. All of human history is composed of people who have stuff and want to keep it, and people who don't have stuff and want to get it. Marx and Engels say that all of history can be explained and described based on that dynamic. People who have stuff and want to keep it, and people who don't have stuff and want to get it. Everything is based on production and based on ownership and demand. Marx and Engels say that society has always failed because it has always been based on people having stuff and wanting to keep it, and not having stuff and wanting to get it. That sense of haves and have-nots have always defined culture and history, and Marx and Engels say that that is wrong and they should not define culture and history. Instead, Marx and Engels propose a new system of government based on equal distribution of goods, based on communes. Perhaps the easiest way to explain Marx and Engels' ideas is to break it down this way. All right? Marx and Engels define their system of government by this statement: each according to his ability, each according to his need. Now, basically, if I translate this and break this down, all right, each according to his ability means that in a commune, in one of these communities set up by Marx and Engels, no one owns anything, all right? You can't own anything. Each person gives to the community according to their ability. So if you are an awesome baker, you would bake stuff for the community. If you are a farmer, you would go out and farm in the fields and bring in your produce and give it to the bakers and the farmers, and they would make food for the community. Everyone gives according to their ability. They give whatever they can, whatever they're good at, that's what they do. Everyone takes from that central coffer, that central storehouse, according to their need. So in other words, people farm sheep, shear their wool. People who are good at that do that. People who are good at weaving then spin that wool into yarn. People who are good at knitting will then make that yarn into sweaters. Whoever needs a sweater goes and takes one from the general coffer. You don't worry about paying for anything because you quote-unquote pay by giving according to your ability. There is no money, no shortage of anything. Everyone gives according to their ability and everyone takes according to their need. It is a beautiful, beautiful dream. It is a beautiful picture. The idea of no one going cold, no one going hungry because they simply take what they need. The idea of no one having to look for a job because they simply give whatever they can. It's a beautiful idea. The problem is it never works. Why not? Well, several reasons. One reason is that the whole taking according to your need thing is again a beautiful idea, but there's a really fine line between need and want. If you've ever gone to the grocery store when you're really hungry, you understand what I mean by the difference between need and want. what we consider that we need is often not really what we need. It's what we want. We go for things based on our desires, our wants, not based on our needs, and therefore we would always take more than we need in validating the basic system. Now, this need-want dynamic is a big issue for Marxist communism. The other thing that's a big issue is the whole idea of the fact that the proletariat, the common people, are supposed to rule themselves. There's no one in charge of the commune, no one in charge of the community checking to see that people give according to their ability and take according to their need. Instead, everyone is supposed to simply rule themselves, give what they can, take what they need, and any decisions are made by the group as a whole. That idea never seems to work because as human beings, we're not good at not owning anything, giving openly, and taking only what we need. Now, for the record, where communism is going to come in and where it's very important for us to understand, communism is going to become very important because as there turn out to be problems throughout the 20th century, when poverty hits, during the Great Depression, communism is just going to keep coming back. Communism sounds like a terrible idea when you have stuff. If you have a car to drive to the grocery store, then the idea of someone just showing up at your front door and saying, hey, gonna borrow the car, need it, is not cool. If you're the person who doesn't have a car, the idea of being able to borrow a car whenever you need it is awesome. So, a lot of people, as they become poor and desperate, are going to find communism a highly attractive idea. The other thing we have to talk about here is a fellow by the name of Charles Darwin. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of Charles Darwin. You know about the theory of evolution, blah, blah, blah. Okay, now, what's Darwin got to do with us? Darwin's ideas have a lot to do with humanities in the 20th century, and there are a couple things you really, really, really need to understand about Darwin. Darwin proposes a system in which creatures adapt to survive. Darwin's ideas originate on one of his journeys around the world. He sees and studies creatures across a chain of islands. On each of those islands, the creatures are the same, so in other words, it's the same species of bird on all the islands. But on different islands, those birds have adapted different characteristics in order to survive and get more food. So, for example, on one island, birds might have longer beaks because that helps them get bugs. On another island, birds might have longer legs. That helps them get bugs, and so on and so forth. Darwin proposes that creatures adapt in order to survive, to be able to get more food, to be able to get more resources. And they pass on those adaptations to their offspring, which mean their offspring are more likely to survive. Creatures that do not adapt die off over time. Now, Darwin's idea of creatures adapting to survive basically eventually spins off into his idea that that could have happened over millions and billions of years, and ultimately one creature could have adapted so extremely that it would appear to be a different kind of creature. Darwin eventually proposes a theory of the idea that human beings actually could have emerged on the planet through adaptation without any divine intervention. Now, Darwin's theories are really, really important to us for a number of reasons. Number one, Darwin proposes a system where there are limited resources. Limited resources require competition. A number of different groups are going to be competing to have the food and resources they need to survive. Darwin says the species that adapt will survive and get the resources. Species that do not adapt as well will die off. That is natural, that is right, that is the way of things. Darwin also proposes adaptation will lead us to a higher level, a better adapted creature. Thing one, thing two, thing three. Thing three is that Darwin's theory of evolution, the idea of people coming into being through adaptation without supernatural intervention, basically calls one major thing of human history into question. It calls right and wrong, good and bad into question. If we simply have come here by adapting to survive, who's to say what is right or wrong? How do you define morality if no God is involved in telling you right, wrong, good, and evil? Those three things are going to come back and haunt us like majorly big time. So keep those three things in mind, all right? Thing one, limited resources, adapting, surviving. The people who adapt survive. The ones who don't adapt die. Number two, You have this constant adaptation that can bring us to a better place. And number 3, calling questions of morality simply because there is no divine to determine characteristics of good and bad. Now, let me introduce you to 3 people very quickly here who are going to build on Darwin's ideas and come back to haunt us during the 20th century. The first is a gentleman by the name of Gregor Mendel. Gregor Mendel is a scientist who studies inheritance. He actually works with, drum roll, peas. Yeah, that's thrilling, ain't it? Now, Mendel basically experiments with wrinkled skin peas and smooth skin peas, and he breeds the plants together to see when do you get wrinkly skin peas, when do you get smooth skin peas, how does inheritance work. He comes up with a very simple but very effective explanation of inheritance, determining, if you have 2 different plants, one wrinkled, one smooth, you crossbreed them, how many of the plants, the resulting plants will have wrinkled skin, how many of the resulting plants will have smooth skin. Basically, if any of you guys have done an inheritance square in science class, you've worked with Mendel's ideas, the ideas of inheritance, as far as what characteristics will most likely be inherited and which ones will not. So Mendel's ideas of inheritance are going to come back to haunt us. I also have to introduce you to a fellow by the name of Herbert Spencer, who comes up with a concept called social Darwinism. Now, social Darwinism takes the ideas of Darwin, the idea of survival for the fittest, the idea of adapting to survive, the idea of creatures that do not adapt die off, and using the natural order because they can't compete. Spencer's social Darwinism takes those ideas of Darwin and applies them to the human population. Spencer proposes that human beings are being dragged downward on the evolutionary chain and are getting ready to fail instead of going up the evolutionary chain and improving ourselves. Herbert Spencer says that in society, in his time period, in the 1800s in England, he says that the people who are breeding, the people who are having the most children, are the poor, the low class. And by producing the most children, they are reproducing physical problems, ignorance, poverty, and stupidity, all of which he believes are genetic traits. Spencer believes that things like criminal tendencies, poverty, laziness are all inherited characteristics. Spencer believes that those things, poverty, laziness, stupidity, are inherited genetic traits that are being handed down to a larger percentage of the population because the people who are breeding are the poor, the out of work, basically the people who are a plague on society in his time period in England. Spencer says that by creating institutions of charity, we are encouraging that breeding and we are dragging down society. If we want to improve society, the people who should be breeding, the people who should be having children, are the intellectuals, the smart, hard-working people who are going to produce children with positive characteristics. Healthy, smart, educated, hard-working people are the ones who should be having children because that will improve our evolution. We should let the poor die off. We should let nature take its course. Only those who adapt to survive, the fittest in society, the cream of the crop, are the ones who should be breeding. We should follow nature's pattern by letting the successful breed and letting the unsuccessful die off. Now, according to the ideas of science, Herbert Spencer's social Darwinism actually makes sense. It follows the principles of evolution. For most of us, though, we kind of get squicky and twitchy when we talk about, just letting people die off if they can't survive. If they can't adapt to survive, then they deserve to die by natural selection. And yet that's exactly what Spencer proposes. And that is an idea which is springboarded and expanded upon by a fellow by the name of William Bateson. Now, Bateson's someone we're going to come back to. You're going to have a quiz where you have to read about him. Bateson takes the ideas of people breeding, people having children who are the result of pairings which promote good characteristics. And Bateson actually, with the sponsorship of the United States government, begins to propose new ways of improving the human gene pool. Bateson actually creates a new science, and I put the word science in quotation marks, called eugenics, which basically translates to good breeding or well-bred. Eugenics is a science intended to promote the positive evolution of the human race. Bateson wants to improve our chances of creating better human beings, and he wants to do that through selective breeding. Bateson actually gathers family histories on thousands of people, and he actually wants to selectively breed people. He wants to choose who people can marry in order to promote better genetic material. So in other words, if your family line is healthy and intelligent and there's another guy out there who is a good match for you to have children as a woman, well then you don't get to pick who you fall in love with. You're going to marry the person who is genetically the best match for you. Therefore, your children will be better adapted to survive, and you will help along the process of human evolution. Again, if you take morality out of the equation and simply look at it from a cold scientific perspective, it's not a bad idea. Now, it was a terrible idea for William Bateson because he doesn't have the map of the human genome. He doesn't understand genetics the way we do. But what if you could produce superhumans, healthy, eliminate disease, more intelligent, harder working, creating a better society? Wouldn't it be a good idea to do it from a scientific point of view? This idea of eugenics, breeding to create a better human race, is going to become a huge problem. We're going to need this. I lay down this base right here simply because this is going to become a huge issue throughout World War I and World War II. Mostly because the science of eugenics favors Nordic peoples. In other words, they believe that any skin color other than lily white is a genetic defect, inferiority. They are going to base their ideas of intellectual superiority very much tied into education and cultural knowledge, not tied into basic intellect. It's going to become a very ugly pseudoscience, but it does claim itself to have scientific roots because it claims it is building on the ideas of Charles Darwin. Keep it in mind, it's not going away because it's going to come back and connect in very strongly with both our history and with our artwork. Now that we've done all that, let's get on with the modern age and let's go look at some pretty pictures. Let's move on into the modern age and into the art of the modern world.